The fluorescent lights of Sterling Corp's hallowed halls hummed with the same sterile, soul-crushing monotony they had for the better part of 2 decades. For me, Mark Jensen, it had been the soundtrack to my professional life. That hum was more familiar than my own heartbeat, more constant than the sunrise. I was the guy who didn't get a plaque. I didn't have a corner office with a view of something other than another identical office building. My kingdom was a desk nestled somewhere in the digital trenches, surrounded by monitors that glowed with the intricate architecture of our company's crown jewel, Project Chimera. Chimera wasn't just code, it was the engine of Sterling Corp. It was the reason venture capitalists threw money at us like confetti at a second-rate wedding. It was the source of our market dominance, the reason Greg Altman, our shiny new VP of engineering, could afford those ridiculous Italian loafers he wore, the ones that cost more than my first car. And Greg Altman? He was a symphony of buzzwords and self-congratulation, a man who spoke in acronyms and inhaled synergy. He'd waltzed into Sterling 6 months ago, a breath of fresh, or rather, aggressively perfumed, air, and immediately set about reshaping the narrative. My narrative, for starters, it started with whispers, little, insidious things. In casual hallway conversations, at the lukewarm coffee machine, Greg would casually mention his vision for Chimera. He'd talk about the foundational principles he'd instilled. He'd even, on occasion, when he thought he was amongst his acolytes, refer to Chimera as his baby, my baby, the one I'd spent years meticulously crafting, line by painstaking line, from the kernel up, the one that had kept me tethered to this fluorescent hum for longer than I cared to admit. Then came the town hall. It was a Tuesday. Tuesdays are always worse. Tuesdays are the Monday of the week's middle child. Greg, beaming like a man who'd just discovered fire, stood center stage, flanked by a PowerPoint presentation that could have doubled as a suicide note for any aspiring designer. And there it was, slide number 7, a stylized, abstract representation of Chimera's core architecture, rendered in shimmering blues and silvers. And beneath it, in a font that screamed expensive and completely unnecessary, the words, Greg Altman, Visionary Architect of Project Chimera. The room, a sea of Sterling Corp employees, erupted in polite corporate applause, the kind of applause that sounds like a flock of confused pigeons. But in that moment, the hum of the lights seemed to falter. The air grew thin. For the first time in years, I felt a prickle of something beyond the usual quiet satisfaction of a bug-free deploy. It was a cold, sharp sensation, like a shard of glass embedded in my gut. I'd always been the ghost in the machine, the invisible hand that kept Chimera purring. I didn't crave the spotlight. I'd never chased accolades. My reward was clean code, efficient algorithms, and the quiet hum of a system that worked flawlessly. I documented everything, of course. Not for glory, but because that's what you do when you care about something. You leave a breadcrumb trail for future selves, for future colleagues. You build a record. And my record was impeccable. Every commit message, every branching strategy, every obscure comment explaining why I chose a particular, obscure piece of logic, it was all there, in the digital ether, for anyone who bothered to look. But Greg Altman didn't bother to look. He bothered to claim. After the town hall, things escalated. I started getting sidelined. My meeting invites for Chimera's core development discussions mysteriously vanished from my calendar. When I'd inquire, I'd be met with a patronizing smile from Greg or a sheepish shrug from his sycophants. "Oh, Mark, we're just streamlining things," they'd say, their eyes darting away, focusing on the executive vision. Executive vision. That was Greg's favorite phrase, right after synergistic alignment and leveraging untapped potential. It was a linguistic cudgel he used to bludgeon any dissent, any inconvenient truth, like the truth that I was the one who'd built the damn thing. My direct manager, a well-meaning but utterly spineless man named Kevin, tried to intercede, bless his heart. He'd pull me aside, whisper about corporate politics and how Greg was a force of nature. I'd nod, thanks for the warning, Kevin, but my mind was already miles ahead, years ahead. Years of logging into my personal Git repository, a private sanctuary I'd maintained since before Sterling Corp even conceived of Project Chimera. A place where every line of code I'd ever written for the company, from the very first keystroke that birthed the project, was meticulously archived, with timestamps, with metadata, with the irrefutable proof of my authorship. You see, in the digital world, everything leaves a trace. It's like a crime scene, but instead of fingerprints, you have commits and timestamps and author tags. And Greg Altman, in his infinite, oblivious arrogance, had left a massive, gaping hole in his own digital footprint. He was a painter who claimed to have created a masterpiece by simply slapping his name on someone else's canvas. The final straw, as they say, came on a Thursday. Not a Tuesday, but a Thursday, which felt somehow more ominous. A passive-aggressive email landed in my inbox, originating from HR. Subject line: Talent Alignment Strategy, Phase 1. Translation: You're redundant. Thanks for your service. Please pack your bags and try not to weep on the expensive carpet. It was brief, impersonal, and utterly devoid of any acknowledgement of my contributions. No mention of Chimera. No mention of the years I'd poured into making Sterling Corp a success. Just a cold, clinical severance package, a mandatory 2-week notice, and a polite suggestion to return all company property. As I read it, sitting at my gray, utilitarian desk, the fluorescent hum seemed to amplify. It wasn't a sound anymore. It was a physical presence, pressing in on me. The sterile office, once a space of quiet creation, now felt like a gilded cage. Greg Altman's loafers were probably already clicking down the hallway, eager to deliver the news himself, to bask in the glow of his own perceived triumph. He probably thought I'd slink away quietly, a broken man, another casualty of corporate Darwinism. He thought wrong. The thing about being invisible for so long is that you learn to observe. You learn to notice the details others overlook. You learn to stockpile information like a squirrel hoarding nuts for the winter. And I'd been observing Greg. I'd seen his bluster, his superficial understanding, his desperate need for validation, and I'd seen his fatal flaw. He assumed his authority was enough to erase reality. I didn't rage. I didn't make a scene. I simply closed the severance email. I then opened a new document, a secure encrypted file on my personal drive, the one I'd been building for years, the one that held the true genesis of Project Chimera, the original source code, meticulously tagged and dated from the very first commit, the one where my name, Mark Jensen, was stamped in undeniable, immutable metadata. Greg Altman could claim whatever he wanted. He could paint his pretty pictures and spin his fancy yarns, but he couldn't rewrite history, not when I held the original manuscript. And as I looked at that timestamp, the one that predated Greg Altman's presence at Sterling Corp by years, a slow, quiet smile spread across my face. It wasn't the smile of a defeated man. It was the smile of a man who knew he had a meticulously planned, perfectly executed counterplay waiting in the wings. He wanted to take credit for my creation? Fine. He was about to learn that possession is 9/10 of the law, and in the digital realm, ownership is etched in stone, not in PowerPoint slides. The hum of the office lights suddenly sounded less like a death knell and more like a ticking clock. And the countdown had just begun. The silence in the office was no longer a comforting hum of productivity. It was a void. My departure had left a crater, and Sterling Corp was starting to feel the tremors. The carefully constructed edifice Greg Altman had built on the foundations of my labor was beginning to crack. I hadn't lifted a finger since I walked out, but my absence was a far more potent weapon than any I could wield directly. My meticulous preparation had been for this moment. For weeks, I'd been working in the shadows, not with code, but with documents. Every email, every contract, every obscure internal memo that detailed my contributions to Project Chimera, no matter how minor they seemed at the time, was meticulously cataloged. I cross-referenced commit logs with design documents, traced back my initial architectural blueprints, and even unearthed the original server provisioning requests that predated Greg Altman's arrival by years. It was a digital archaeology dig, and I was the only one with the shovel and the map. I had an encrypted backup of my personal Git repository, a digital fortress containing every line of code I'd ever written for Sterling Corp, each commit stamped with my name and a timestamp that was utterly irrefutable. I'd also carefully preserved correspondence with my former manager, Kevin, detailing the gradual sidelining of my role and Greg's increasing, unsubstantiated claims. There were even internal whispers captured in screenshots of hushed Slack conversations between colleagues, subtly acknowledging my ownership and Greg's superficial understanding. This wasn't a hobby. This was my meticulously crafted battle plan, a digital spiderweb waiting to ensnare the unsuspecting fly. The first tremor came subtly, a flicker in the stock price report on my personal monitor during my morning coffee. Then, the whispers from my old colleagues started to filter through. Texts and encrypted messages, disguised as casual catch-ups, painted a picture of escalating chaos. A critical client, Apex Innovations, had reported a severe bug in Chimera, one that the current development team, led by the blissfully ignorant Tyler Gregg's protege, couldn't even begin to diagnose. Apex, it turned out, was threatening to pull their multi-million-dollar contract unless the issue was resolved within 48 hours. Panic had begun to set in. Then came the email chain that made me take a slow, satisfied sip of my now cold coffee. Gregg, in a desperate attempt to rally the troops, had sent a company-wide message about unforeseen technical challenges and the need for accelerated innovation. It was a thinly veiled admission of incompetence. The panic was palpable, rippling through the Sterling Corp Slack channels like a digital contagion. Colleagues I hadn't spoken to in months were now forwarding me panic messages, hoping I held some hidden key, some forgotten knowledge. They didn't realize I was the one turning the lock. The Apex Innovations deadline loomed. The development team, running on fumes and fear, had managed to only make things worse, introducing new instability and corrupting critical data. Sterling Corp's reputation, built painstakingly over years, was starting to crumble. The narrative Gregg had so carefully crafted was unraveling at the seams. He had taken credit for the engine, but he had no idea how to fix it when it sputtered. And then the trap was sprung, not with a bang, but with a polite, meticulously worded email. I sent it from my personal account, addressed to the Sterling Corp's legal counsel, Miss Albright, and CC'd the board of directors and the company's general counsel, Mr. Henderson. The subject line was innocuous: clarification regarding intellectual property ownership of Project Chimera. The body of the email was brief, professional, and devastatingly precise. It began by referencing my recent, amicable departure. Then, it gently, almost apologetically, pointed out an oversight in the recent public discourse regarding the authorship of Project Chimera. It highlighted a specific clause in my original employment contract, a clause I had personally negotiated and inserted back in 2017, a clause buried deep within the appendices of the revised employment agreement, a clause that stipulated that upon termination without cause, all intellectual property authored or materially contributed to by the employee shall revert to said employee. It included a meticulously curated selection of evidence, timestamp commit logs, early architectural diagrams bearing my initials, early design documents, and my detailed personal Git repository showcasing years of sole development. I didn't threaten, I simply presented the facts, backed by irrefutable digital evidence. I also sent a separate, very brief email to the lead investor, Mr. Sterling himself, a man I knew valued tangible assets above all else. My email to him simply stated, I believe there has been a misunderstanding regarding the ownership of Project Chimera's core intellectual property. I have provided a detailed clarification to Sterling Corp's legal department. I trust your due diligence will address this matter promptly. The response was not immediate, but the shift in the digital atmosphere was palpable. The panicked Slack messages from colleagues ceased. The frantic emails from HR about returning company property went silent. Instead, an eerie quiet descended. The hum of the office lights, once a monotonous drone, now felt like the thrum of a bomb ticking down. They knew they had a problem. They knew I was the cause. But they still had no idea of the true extent of the leverage I held, nor the precision with which I wielded it. The game had changed, and Sterling Corp was about to realize they were playing for stakes they hadn't even conceived of. The silence that had descended upon Sterling Corp after my email was heavier than any I had experienced in my years within those sterile walls. It wasn't the quiet of contemplation, it was the dead air before a hurricane. The panicked flurry of activity that characterized the previous days had evaporated, replaced by a gnawing dread. The digital tremors I'd initiated had become a full-blown earthquake, and the bedrock of Gregg Altman's manufactured success was crumbling beneath him. The call came late on a Tuesday. Tuesdays were always worse. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar 800 number, but I knew instinctively who it was. I let it ring twice, picturing the desperate faces on the other end of the line. When I finally answered, my voice was calm, devoid of any triumph, just a quiet certainty. Mark Jensen speaking, I said. A strained, almost unrecognizable voice crackled through the receiver. Mark, it's Nathan Sterling, the founder. The man who had, at one point, actually understood the value of a solid codebase. His voice, usually booming with self-assuredness, was thin, reedy, laced with a desperation that was almost pathetic. Mr. Sterling, I replied, my tone neutral. To what do I owe the pleasure? Pleasure? Mark, what the hell is going on? Albright, she just showed me what you sent. This IP reversion clause? This is insane. You can't possibly be serious about claiming ownership of Chimera. I took a slow sip of my tea, the warmth spreading through me like a quiet assurance. Serious, Mr. Sterling? I've always been serious about my work. It seems, however, that the executive leadership became less serious about acknowledging it. There was a choke sound on the other end. But Altman, he's been leading the development, his vision. I cut him off gently. Greg Altman's vision, Mr. Sterling, was for a promotion. My vision was for a functional, robust, and scalable product. The evidence of who achieved that vision is, as I've provided, quite clearly documented. My Git logs, my architectural diagrams, my commit history, they predate Mr. Altman's tenure by years. The contract clause is explicit. Termination without cause, and all IP authorship reverts to the employee. I was terminated without cause, Mr. Sterling, and I authored Project Chimera. His voice rose, tinged with disbelief and burgeoning panic. But the company, it's built on Chimera. If you truly own it, this could bankrupt us. We're talking to investors next week. Indeed, I said, my voice steady, which is why I thought it prudent to provide everyone with a clear understanding of the situation before those crucial meetings. Transparency, as they say, is key in business, especially when one is attempting to sell a product one doesn't actually own. Silence, a heavy, suffocating silence. Then a desperate whisper. What do you want, Mark? Name your price. Anything. Just don't do this. This was it, the moment of truth, the culmination of years of quiet competence, of being overlooked, of building something truly magnificent and watching someone else try to claim it. I had two paths, both paved with consequence. I see two options, Mr. Sterling, I began, my voice calm and measured. Option A, Greg Altman resigns his position, effective immediately, and Sterling Corp publicly acknowledges my sole authorship of Project Chimera. In return, I will release the IP back to the company under a licensing agreement with terms to be negotiated. You retain your company, your investors, and your market position. I paused, letting the weight of Option A settle. Then I continued. Option B, should you choose not to accept, is considerably less pleasant for Sterling Corp. Without the core IP, Project Chimera is essentially worthless. Your ongoing development efforts will be seen as derivative work, subject to infringement claims. The Apex Innovations contract will undoubtedly be terminated. The upcoming investor meetings will be a disaster, likely resulting in significant financial penalties and a complete loss of investor confidence. In this scenario, I will not license the IP. Instead, I will pursue full acquisition, either through a direct buyout, a sum that would likely exceed your current market valuation several times over, or through legal channels, which will involve significant public scrutiny of your company's intellectual property practices and Mr. Altman's fabricated claims. Another prolonged silence. I could almost hear the frantic, whispered conversations on their end, the gears of desperation grinding. Nathan Sterling wasn't a fool. He understood the gravity of the situation. He knew he'd been outmaneuvered, not by malice, but by a meticulous adherence to truth and contract. You can't be serious, he finally stammered. I've never been more serious, Mr. Sterling, I replied. My work is my legacy. I invested years of my life into Project Chimera, not for accolades, but for the integrity of the code. Integrity that Mr. Altman so easily dismissed. You have a choice. Acknowledge the truth and salvage what you can, or cling to a fabrication and watch your company dissolve. The conversation ended abruptly, not with a polite farewell, but with a click. I hung up the phone and leaned back in my chair. The quiet in my apartment was profound. There was no elation, no surge of vindictive pleasure, just a deep sense of closure. The hum of my refrigerator seemed louder, more comforting than the sterile buzz of Sterling Corp's fluorescent lights ever was. Within 2 hours, the first domino fell. A press release, terse and devoid of any positive spin, landed in my inbox. It announced Greg Altman's immediate resignation from Sterling Corp, citing irreconcilable differences in strategic vision. It was a carefully worded euphemism for caught with his hand in the digital cookie jar and no explanation for how it got there. The real endgame, however, was yet to unfold publicly. But I knew with absolute certainty that Option A had been chosen. The swiftness of Altman's departure and the absence of any attempt to fight my claims in public was confirmation. A few days later, I received a formal notification from Sterling Corp's legal team. It was a licensing agreement, drafted with newfound respect and a surprising degree of urgency. The terms were generous, far exceeding what I might have asked for in a direct buyout. Greg Altman was officially a ghost in the machine, his name scrubbed from the narrative, his reputation likely in tatters. Sterling Corp would survive, but it would carry the indelible mark of my authorship, a constant reminder of the man they underestimated, the man who built their empire and then, quite literally, took it back. My new reality was quiet, peaceful, and filled with the satisfaction of a job meticulously done. I had no desire to return to the corporate rat race, no hunger for public recognition. My reward was the knowledge that I had reclaimed my work, my integrity, and my peace. If watching corporate hubris meet its match with meticulous planning and irrefutable evidence is your kind of justice, then consider hitting that like button and subscribing. Stories like mine are a reminder that in the digital age, every action leaves a trace, and every claim can be verified. For Greg Altman, the executive ladder had crumbled, replaced by the cold, hard reality of intellectual property theft and a career demolition he brought entirely upon himself. He'd wanted to be the visionary architect. Instead, he became a cautionary tale, a testament to the fact that you can't build a reputation on someone else's code. You can only build your own. And mine, etched in every line of Project Chimera, would stand the test of time.